Yes.
Thanks.
Surrogate.
Thank you, sir. Could we have NHBT 0017448 underscore 004, please? This is a letter, perhaps if we can just zoom into the top half, thank you. This is a letter from Dr. Krask to you, dated the 12th of May 1983. Then if we go down to the second and third paragraphs, please. We can see that Dr. Krask tells you that from a recent review of the literature I've made, I am doubtful whether the use of a screening test, such as hepatitis B core antibody, will detect some patients early enough in the stage of their disease to remove the risk of transmission of infection by transfusion in relation to... Sorry, let me start again. Sorry.
Take your time.
If I might just get a glass of water, that will help. Thank you. Apologies, Professor Barbara. This is a letter from Dr. Krask to you in May 1983, and it's headed Screening of Blood Donors to Remove the Risk of Transmission of the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. And Dr. Krask writes in the second paragraph, from a recent review of the literature I've made, I'm doubtful whether the use of a screening test, such as hepatitis B core antibody, will detect some patients early enough in the stage of their disease to remove the risk of transmission of infection by transfusion. There is then reference to what's become known as the San Francisco baby case, and then he says, I think it will be worthwhile investigating the possible use of screening tests which might be found to be suitable at a later date, but I think the only effective way will be to use some sort of questionnaire to donors and to rely on their altruism and honesty with regard to homosexual exposure. You, as I understand it, Professor Barbara, you didn't agree with Dr. Krask's view of the utility of hepatitis B core antibody testing in relation to screening for AIDS. Is that right?
Could we just go back to that bit of the para where that he makes that comment?
Indeed, it's the second paragraph.
Because the wording is important. I'm doubtful whether the use of a screening test such as anti-Hcv will detect some patients early enough in the stage of their disease.
I think he must mean, must he not, some donors, because this is talking about the risk of passing it on, isn't it? Have I got it wrong?
Sorry, Sir Brian, I missed the first part of your question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll just remove my mask. I was just wondering about the use of the word patients, because what he's talking about, I think, is avoiding the risk of a donor with AIDS or with HIV infection, with an infection which may transmit AIDS, passing it on. And when the word patients is used here, it's talking about donors, presumably, is it?
I think so, Sir Brian. I think John Krask is using the word patient as a sort of generic term, a potential donor who might actually be a patient.
Yes.
But what I didn't agree with is the aspect that we're not aiming to detect a donor who is undergoing hepatitis B infection, but we're looking at anti-HBC in the context of a phrase that virologists use about viruses running in packs, a common source of infection for various agents, like intravenous drug use. And my feeling was that there was some possible merit, certainly worth considering, of anti-HBC as an indication of past or present infection with an agent that could, as it were, co-infect with HIV.
We've already heard...
Sorry, does that make sense?
Thank you, Professor Barbara. We've already heard that the North London Centre introduced confidential questionnaires given to their donors, and that those questionnaires included a box that a donor could tick to say, please don't use my blood for donation. You then tested those donations, didn't you, that came from those donors who ticked that box?
Yes, and we would have looked at anti-HBC.
And what did you find in relation to the correlation between people ticking that box and the results of hepatitis B core antibody testing?
I don't remember the exact figures. Doubtless it's in our literature somewhere, either yours or mine or both. But there was an increased rate of anti-HBC in donors ticking the box.
So it might suggest that hepatitis B core antibody testing was a useful marker to eliminate donors who shouldn't have donated.
In the context of HIV, it was a potential surrogate test that could be considered, but you'd have to also consider the numbers that didn't test positive and the possibility that if someone had anti-core, it wasn't caused by a factor that would put them at risk. They may have been born, with an early infection of hepatitis B. So it was an idea, but it wasn't a clear-cut idea.
But your view at the time, Professor Barbara, as I understand it, was that that would have been a useful surrogate test.
It could have been a useful... I don't think I ever formulated it in my own head as something that I would definitely want to press ahead with, but it was an idea, it was a concept that might have some utility.
And in centres where there was not the opportunity to tick a box on a confidential questionnaire to say, please don't use my blood, might the hepatitis B core antibody testing have been of particular use?
Yes, in the absence of a self-exclusion questionnaire, it may have had some value.
Because it would have picked up those people who you identified where there was a correlation between ticking the box and testing positive on the hepatitis B core antibody testing.
Yes, but unfortunately, it would also have detected people who had been infected at birth, early in life, or soon after, maybe because they were in areas of high hepatitis, came from countries of high hepatitis B incidence.
Once HTLV3 screening tests were introduced, in the North London Centre, it's right, isn't it, that when a sample tested positive initially, then you test it in duplicate to assess whether it was a repeat reactive?
Correct.
And if it was, then the blood would be collected and held.
The blood would be withdrawn from inventory and kept in my laboratory in a designated secure fridge.
And at that point, is it right that it would then be tested using the Western Blot test?
We would send the samples to our reference laboratory. This was 1985 and after, before we had our own reference laboratory, and they would do repeat tests. There would be a Western Blot test, and also in my laboratory, I had developed a modified hemoglutination assay using reagents from a Japanese company, Fujirebio, where you could dilute the cells, the red cells used in the assay, and then put them into V-weld microplates, centrifuge, and you would get a dot. You'd put the plate at a slope, and if the dot stayed as a dot, it was agglutination, and if it formed a teardrop streak as those red cells fell down the well, it was a negative. And that enabled us quite economically and rapidly and very sensitively to titrate the positivity. And if you got a titer by this assay of, say, over 1 in 32 or 1 in 64, and they could range out to 1 in 1,000, you could be, gives you a lot of confidence that it's a real positive.
And when did that set of testing in your laboratory become available?
It was soon after the ELISAs became available, and it was something that we found very useful as an adjunct to the ELISA testing. So it would have been sort of mid to later 1980s.
Do you recall if that testing that you developed was available before or after the first generation of screening tests?
It was after.
And can you help us in relation to the Western Blot test? In the documents, and we'll come to it in a bit more detail in a moment, there's a lot of discussion about confirmatory testing that I understand was done at the Middlesex Hospital.
Yes.
Was that the Western Blot test, or was that some other form of confirmatory testing?
I'm pretty certain now that it was the Western Blot. And as I've said elsewhere, a straightforward ELISA gives you a yes/no. There is antibody or there isn't antibody. The Western Blot, if I put it this way, allows you to see the anatomy of the antibody response. So you could see which antibodies to which components of the virus were present. And the more you would want at least 2 antibody lines. So the more components of the virus that could be detected with the antibodies in the Western Blot, the more confident you were of the genuineness of the reaction.
Is it right that the Western Blot test had been available for some time prior to the ELISA testing?
No, I don't think so, because you would have needed to have the virus isolated, and in the Western Blot, you would break up the virus, run it down a polyacrylamide gel, blot off that tube of gel, and get a series of viral antigen lines stuck onto the blot. Then you'd add your sample, and the antibodies would bind to that. So you needed to have isolated the virus and defined it.
But in terms of the technique of the Western blot test, that technique had been developed, albeit in relation to other viruses.
Indeed, yes. Western blot was a recognized form of assay.
The first generation screening tests were available from March 1985, but you had concerns about those first generation screening tests in relation particularly to false positive rates. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Given that the technique of the Western blot test was available prior to March 1985, why was that not a solution to the concerns about false positive rates?
That's a good question. I presume because laboratories or manufacturers hadn't formulated the Western blot around HIV. But that is my presumption at this time. I can't remember. That is the best answer I can give to that question.
And in terms of your concerns about false positive rates, can you help us with what they were particularly?
Yes. With the ELISAs that Dr. Robert Gallo licensed when he had discovered, in inverted commas, HTLV3 in inverted commas, the manufacturers had to use his cell line, which was rich in HLA antigens. And I've described elsewhere how the virus buds through the infected cell and takes with it cell wall antigens, which will contain HLA antigens. And when you do your test, anybody who's got HLA antibodies would come up as reactive. And the reactivity rate could be anything from 2 to 10% of tests, and only about 1 in 10 of the reactives would be confirmable as real.
At the time of the first generation screening tests, was your understanding and expectation that confirmatory tests were in the pipeline and likely to arrive pretty soon?
We knew they were working on them, but to be honest, I didn't have a time frame for when they might become available.
You've talked us through your concern about the false positive rates and the possible numbers that were involved. Would you accept that by waiting for confirmatory testing to be available, it meant that blood that was infected with HTLV3 was entering the blood banks and out to the hospitals and on to recipients?
Yes, I would accept that, but I would also make the comment that initially the feeling was, and this was because there was such a long, if you like, incubation period between infection and the development of immune suppression and the various diseases that allowed in to the patient, there was a feeling that only a small proportion of infected people would go on to become ill and symptomatic.
And was that a feature of your thinking when you were raising concerns about false positive rates?
Yes, that would have been in my mind as well, yes.
With the benefit of hindsight, might it not have been better to use the first generation tests to enable blood to have been put on hold and then to be re-looked at when confirmatory testing came on stream?
With the benefit of hindsight and knowing what we now know about the severity of HIV, I think we could, maybe should, have examined how we might do that without totally disrupting the management and the supply of donors and donations, because the same considerations apply to HCV, which doubtless you will come on to. And the problem was that in the UK, certainly, we wouldn't exclude a donor without telling them. If we were to exclude a significant number, remember just at North London it was 1,000 donors a day, and if we were excluding 10 to 50, say, just as a figure that might have been, the practicalities of doing that safely and securely would have been very difficult. Then you've got the knock-on effect of the impact on the supply of available blood for the hospitals, and then you would have to work out what you told the donors.
And that issue of what you tell the donors was something that was Professor Contreras' role. Is that right? Rather than yours?
I was able to counsel donors. As I told you, I had initiated the Hepatitis B Counseling in the service. It was about the first in the country, with Dr. Dane's advice and with any input and help that I needed from clinical colleagues, but mainly Dr. Hewitt and a team of other medical doctors would have been doing the talking to the donors. And this would have presumably included talking to donors who may have been infected, but we couldn't be sure, which would have been a very difficult discussion to have had.
I want to move on then, Professor Barbara, to hepatitis C surrogate testing. We picked up some of that earlier this morning, and we discussed the centre's use of hepatitis B core antibody, ALT and AST testing in a case of post-transfusion hepatitis. We move forwards now to 1987. If we could have PRSE 303767, please. If we can zoom into the right-hand column, please, and the top of it. We have here a letter that you wrote with Professor Contreras to the Lancet, and it's the Lancet dated the 1st of August 1987, discussing the testing of blood donations for non-A, non-B hepatitis. And it's responding to a letter from Scottish colleagues that the inquiry has seen previously. And in the second paragraph, you and Professor Contreras say this: has the time for a prospective study already passed in relation to surrogate testing? This seems to imply that the longer an unproven test is used, the greater becomes the pressure to use it. This is not an argument that should commend itself to those practicing transfusion medicine. Why should we have to wait 3 to 4 years for an answer? If the problem is serious, this will be revealed in acute non-A, non-B hepatitis within a year of initiating the study. The need for controlled studies of the incidence of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis will not disappear with the introduction of routine screening of blood donations with tests of unproven value. And then you carry on to say, how far can the argument stretch that all known methods should be used to avoid the risk of non-A, non-B hepatitis after transfusion? The bulk of non-A, non-B hepatitis may still be transmitted even after surrogate screening. Are we certain that patients would succeed in a legal action if they contract non-A, non-B hepatitis after the transfusion of blood untested for hepatitis B core antibody? Why should non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis be such a special case that we have to make tremendous efforts to prevent occasional infections? Is it a fair reading of this letter, Professor Barbara, that the premise of your argument, yours and Professor Contreras' argument, is that non-A, non-B hepatitis infections were occasional?
Yes, I think our understanding at the time was that they were occasional. As you know, we did try and monitor any post-transfusion hepatitis infections that might relate to non-A, non-B. And of course, we also had the feeling that non-A, non-B was not as severe as hepatitis B.
And then if we carry on down through the letter to the final 3 paragraphs.
Remind me of the date of this, please.
August 1987.
Yeah, thank you.
It picks up, transfusion services must not bow to irrational pressure for measures whose efficacy is unproven. In the UK, transfusion centre directors resisted commercial pressure for premature introduction of unsatisfactory screening tests for anti-HIV. They should show the same resolution with non-A, non-B hepatitis. Before we pick up about the non-A, non-B hepatitis, can you help us with what you were referring to in relation to the commercial pressure for premature introduction of HIV testing?
Yes, companies would have been very keen, the initially licensed companies would have been very keen for the blood service to introduce anti-HIV testing because, of course, it was a huge market.
And then the letter goes on, at our transfusion centre, 400,000 blood components are available for transfusion per annum. We've received an average of only 4 reports of non-A, non-B post-transfusion hepatitis annually for the past 10 years, and we repeatedly remind clinicians of the need to report infective complications of blood transfusion. Again, was your view of the value of surrogate testing based on your understanding of the limited number of post-transfusion hepatitis reports from clinicians?
Yes, the limited number of reports, our perception of the limited clinical benefit and our awareness of the diversion of resources that introduction of surrogates would have entailed. Cost, in other words.
Given that the centre was using these tests to decide whether to exclude a donor from the panel when there had been a report of post-transfusion hepatitis, why was that not then good enough to apply to the screening of all donations?
If you consider the whole range of donations, and then concentrate on a report of possible post-transfusion hepatitis, you are, if you like, narrowing down the focus where you can concentrate your efforts and get the most value out of the surrogate testing. So it's what I said before, you got the smoking gun, so it merited that concentration of effort. And that really didn't apply for the whole range of donations.
Was that a resource question, Professor Barbara?
It was partly a resource question, and that wasn't just in terms of the cost of the test, but of course the staffing. But it would also involve a diversion, a reduction in the amount of available blood for issue. And of course, it would also mean that donor management and donor counselling would you'd have to take that into account, because there would have been considerable implications for that as well.
Then if we move forward to June 1989, NHBT 5076 _ 037, please. We've got a meeting on the 9th of June 1989 of the National Study on Surrogate non-A non-B hepatitis markers in blood donors, and we can see just under the stamp on the right that you were present and you were acting as the secretary at that meeting. Then if we go over the page, as part of the progress reports, we see, sorry, back one page, should be page 2. So I'm afraid we've had a difficulty. We don't have page 2 and 3. It's a very short part of page 2 that perhaps I can simply read. Into
I think read it out, but take it slowly so that Professor Barbara can follow.
Absolutely.
And if he wants you to repeat it, please just ask, Professor.
Thank you.
There is a heading NLBTC, so the North London Centre. And you are, it says this, Dr. Barbara, report F. 1 in 150 anti-HBC negative donors were repeatably anti-HCV positive. 2.2% of 64 NLBTC donors with elevated ALT were anti-HCV positive. Dr. Barbara received additional data from the centre during the meeting for anti-HCV rates in anti-HBC positive donors. The revised figures for this data, following repeat testing, is 4.4% of anti-HBC positive donors have given positive results for anti-HCV, 1 in 23. To date, the anti-HCV test provided consistent results and was convenient to perform. So as at June 1989, it appears to have been your view, Professor Barbara, that the anti-HCV tests were producing consistent results. Is that your recollection?
In terms of repeatability of reactivity, so whether the reaction was real or false positive, it was consistent in as much as it would come up again when you retested it.
If we then turn to page 4 of the document, please. we have 3.7.4 donors positive for anti-HCV. Repeatable anti-HCV positive or grey zone donors should be flagged without counselling or notification, plasma to be stored frozen, future donations to be treated similarly, pending decision on the significance of the anti-HCV assay. Next to the word counselling, we can see a little asterisk, and the asterisk takes us to the bottom of the page. Keep going further down, please. There's a further heading under the name Dr. John Barbara. Yes, it's at the very bottom there, the heading Anti-HCV reactions and donor counselling. Thank you. It reads, on reflection and after discussion with Dr. Hewitt, consultant in medical charge of microbiology, and Dr. Christine Moore, we feel that the anti-HCV results should not be withheld from the donor at counselling, especially if they corroborate one or both surrogate marker findings. Notification would include emphasis that the test is still in the research phase, as they were informed at the beginning of the trial. Findings may not be absolute, but are extra evidence suggesting that the donation is unsuitable for transfusion. We think this will reduce rather than increase doubt and worry on the part of the donor. Provided orthodiagnostics allow us to do so, we think that the GP should also be informed of these results as research findings.
Yes, I've read that, thank you.
This view that you had taken, together with Dr. Raffat, Dr. Hewitt and Dr. Moore, appears to suggest that in the research...
Sorry, could we have that back again so that I can keep be able to look at it?
There we go.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
It appears from this note in these meeting minutes that you and others had taken the view that in the context of a research trial, donors could be told about results that you weren't entirely sure of the significance of. Is that fair?
Yes, in fact, in a research trial, one might argue there was less ethical pressure to inform donors of any, if you like, positive findings, because this wasn't an extant part of our testing repertoire. But obviously, on reflection here, even though it was a research trial, and this emphasizes the importance we attach to keeping our donors informed, even though it was a research trial, we obviously had recommended that the donors would be told, with all the emphases that you can see presented here.
And so in the face of uncertainty, you and your colleagues had found a formulation that you felt was appropriate to use with donors?
In the limited context of a trial with limited numbers of donors that would then be involved. And if you can't really extrapolate that to routine donor screening, because the numbers would have been far more enormous. And also, because it was a trial, one be able to say to the donors, as a clearer understanding evolves, we will inform you.
In thinking about extrapolating it to all donors, Was the difficulty a matter of resources for that counselling to happen?
Extrapolating to all donors, yes, the resources would have been an important factor, and as I've said before, the impact on the blood supply would have been significant as well.
Can we turn now to NHBT 5017_006, please? We have, in fact, could we look at the whole of the first page to start with? Thank you. We can see at the bottom of this page the initials DH, JAB and RME, 23,689. The JAB there is you, isn't it?
Yes, and the DH is the late Dr. Howell. Yeah.
So this was a preliminary report number 2 on the HCV assay.
Yes.
And there's then a couple of pages of some tables of results, but if we carry on to page 4, there's another problem with documents, sir. Page 4 is missing. It's 2 bullet points that I wanted to take Professor Barbara to, so if I may, I'll simply read it into the record. On page 4, there is a heading, general comments. 1, test seems reproducible, robust and meaningful. 2, confirmation of some sort is obviously required. Does that accord with your recollection of your views in June 1989 of the hepatitis C testing?
That it was reproducible,
robust,
yes,
and meaningful.
As I said previously, certainly with any test, if you tested and got a result and retested and got a different result, you'd be very unhappy with it. And that wasn't the case with the assay. So the results you got, whatever they meant, were reproducible and therefore robust. And sorry, what was the second point?
It was reproducible, robust and meaningful. And then the second point was the need for confirmatory testing.
Yes, yeah, that was important.
Can we then pick up NHBT 40188_017, please? Thank you. This is a letter to the Lancet from yourself and Professor Contreras. It's dated the 8th of August 1989. If we can then carry on down to the body of the letter, please. You say this. There's been a flurry of publications on hepatitis C in the Lancet. We agree that the new next paragraph. We agree that the new ortho-ELISA for anti-HCV clearly appears to be a specific assay for the major agent causing post-transfusion non-A, non-B hepatitis. It's obviously incomparable with any of the previous attempted assays for non-A, non-B virus and provides a welcome advance over surrogate markers for infection with this virus. However, in the context of donor screening, precipitate action should be avoided. As in any other assay, the predictive value of a positive result hinges on the prevalence of the marker in a given population. While the test scores well in panels of well-characterised non-A, non-B sera, and in samples from patients with a diagnosis of non-A, non-B hepatitis, we do not know the predictive value of the test in low prevalence populations such as UK blood donors. In this context, it's essential to have confirmatory assays to eliminate, for example, the possibility of cross-reactivity with yeast antigens before sensible policies for generalised screening of blood donations are implemented. It carries on. You discuss an evaluation that's been undertaken, and you say between 0.5 to 1% of blood donations have been found to be repeatedly reactive, unpublished observations. Excluding this proportion of blood donors might appear to be a minimal problem. However, when related to the annual 2.5 million blood donations in the UK, the problem is certainly not trivial. And you also highlight the enormous and costly undertaking would be required of contacting and counselling blood donors. And then over the page, considerations of the cost effectiveness of routine donor screening must await the advent of reliable confirmatory tests as well as faster screening tests. Professor Barbara, this letter was written in August 1989. In relation to confirmatory testing, at that point, were you aware of confirmatory testing being developed?
I was aware that people were working on confirmatory testing. I didn't know what stage it was at.
Was your sense that it would be available very soon?
In all honesty, I can't recall.
If we just look again at that final sentence of the letter, the considerations of the cost effectiveness of the donor screening, that appears to rather sum up your concerns about the hepatitis C tests in relation to the cost, both in terms of the cost of doing the tests, the loss of blood donors, and the difficulties in relation to counselling donors. Is that fair?
Yes, it's worth remembering that roughly all previous screening tests would have cost for each test for the up to 2 million donations a year in the blood service, would have cost anything up to, with HIV, it became 50 pence a test. The economical assay I developed for hepatitis B was actually pennies a test, and also would be charging £2 a test. So in terms of the overall impact on budget, it would have been enormous. So I think cost effectiveness did figure very highly in our considerations. Could I also, if we go back to the beginning of that letter, is that possible?
Page 1.
This letter here, if we go back right to the first paragraphs.
NHBT 40188 underscore 017.
Oh, second paragraph, if we could, please. Again, with hindsight, our wording would have been better that Anti-Hcv clearly appears to be an assay specific for the major agent causing post-transfusion non-A, non-B hepatitis. And certainly all myself and my colleagues were excited at the realization that this assay would be doing very well in Harvey Alter's panel, which was used to test candidate assays. Previous to this assay, none of them showed any correlation with the status of the samples. So when this assay came, it gave us considerable hope that there would be the ability to specifically detect. But I'm making this point because it wasn't an assay of high specificity. It was an assay specific for that agent. Thank you for your patience.
Following on from that, given that it was, as you understood it, specific to that agent, would it not have been better to introduce the testing at this stage, even if that had meant that you couldn't have any confirmatory testing?
The same arguments apply to what we discussed previously with HIV, and again, the question of the severity and the clinical impact of non-A, non-B was still something that hadn't been fully elucidated.
If we move forwards to...
Well,
sorry.
May I just ask a question about this? Can we just highlight, please, the second paragraph again? Prior to this, prior to the cloning of hepatitis, what became known as hepatitis C by, I think it was by the Chiron Corporation, there had been considerable discussion about surrogate testing for non-A, non-B, had there not?
Yes, sir.
And there was a difference of view, as I understand it, between those who thought it was worth introducing and those who thought it might not be. Here, the second sentence, it's obviously incomparable, that is the ortho-ELISA test, with any of the previous attempted assays for NA and NB virus. And then this, and provides a welcome advance over surrogate markers for infection with this virus. Now, it might be thought to follow that if it was an advance over surrogate markers, I mean, do you agree that it was an advance over surrogate markers?
Yes, Sir Brian.
It would make the case for introducing some sort of test, which otherwise surrogate markers would have indicated, rather stronger, one might have thought. Would that be a fair conclusion?
Yes, I think that's a fair comment.
And perhaps you can help with this. One of the downsides of introducing a test with aimed at identifying non-A, non-B, rather than hoping to eliminate non-A, non-B by identifying other markers, is that you would wish to talk to the donor concerned, because plainly they may have a problem and they have to know about it. What would suppose you had a surrogate testing, would that have involved talking to donors whose donations were excluded? You did say earlier, I think, that if any donation was not accepted, you would expect to tell the donor that that was the case, and broadly why.
Yes, Sir Brian, if we were, say, to have introduced combined raised ALT and anti-HBC testing, and then one of the options was to consider anyone who had raised ALT and who was anti-HBC positive as a higher risk for non-A, non-B, then that the donations would have been excluded. And we would have then told the donor that we were excluding future donations, and we would try and explain why, which would have been a bit difficult because we would have to tell them that we were trying to err on the side of safety while we regretted having to lose their current and future donations. It also would raise the question of whether we then needed to do look back on the recipients of previous donations from that donor.
So, if indeed, as you think it was, this was a considerable advance on surrogate assays, is it likely that there would probably be less counselling of those who were not infected than would have been the case with surrogate testing had it been introduced?
Do you mean there would be fewer donors as candidates for counselling because there would have been fewer of them detected by the assay?
Yes, I do.
I can't work those figures out offhand.
I mean, don't try and do it now. If you have a moment after this to think, well, what would the comparative figures probably have been, as best you can tell, please let us know. I think it's better to do that than try and say something now which may not be right.
Yes. Yes, so comparing the donor loss with first generation HCV and surrogate testing. That's a very interesting point, and I can't remember if that had ever come up. It may have done. But yes, thank you for that.
No, well, thank you.
I want to move on to the second generation testing. Could we have NHBT 40191_011, please? It's a letter from Ortho to you, dated the 11th of January 1991, and it says, in order that I can ship you the second generation Reba HCV assay for clinical evaluation, I'm required by the US Food and Drug Administration to have you sign and return the attached declaration. And then over the page we have the signed forms that we don't need to go to. Do you recall whether or not you were in fact sent the second generation Reba assay?
No, I'm sorry, I can't recall. I presume I would have been if I signed it and sent it off, and we would have been keen to see it. But I can't specifically recall, I'm sorry.
And do you recall doing any testing of the second generation Reba?
I'm sure we did. But details, no, I cannot recall.
Then if we turn to NHBT 5073_065, please. We have a letter from Dr. Gunson to all RTDs, dated the 3rd of April 1991. Then if we go to the body of the letter, please. It says this: "You'll recall that in my letter to you of the 15th of February, I suggested that the 1st of July 1991 might be an appropriate date to commence anti-HCV screening of blood donations. You may be aware," the second paragraph, "you may be aware that since the 3-centre trial of anti-HCV tests was completed, Ortho and Abbott have produced second-generation test kits which have additional antigens to the C100 of the test we've evaluated. There may also be other companies supplying anti-HCV tests." And then the final paragraph on this page: "It's undoubtedly in our interest that this evaluation takes place. However, to complete this study and become operational by the 1st of July 1991 is too tight a schedule. It's difficult to state precisely a revised date, but I think we should aim to commence routine screening for anti-HCV by the 1st of September 1991. As I understand it, Professor Barbara, you agreed with Dr. Gunson's suggestion that evaluation was required.
Yes, I think evaluation would have been required. If we could go back to the beginning so that I can get my head around the dates again.
Of course, it's
and
dated,
which tests.
it's dated the 3rd of April 1991.
And it's in regard to which generation of ELISA?
If you just go to the second paragraph of the letter.
I think it's actually a Reba test rather than an ELISA.
It is a Reba test, yes.
Ah, sorry. Forgive me. I'm getting fuddled.
I think, am I right in thinking that the first generation test was an ELISA test?
Yes, yes.
And the
second generation too.
Second generation was a Reba test? Reba assay?
Sorry, Sir Brian. The second generation test was also an ELISA, but it had more antigens on the solid phase of the microplate of the ELISA.
Right.
The Rebas were always confirmatory tests.
Yes. So when we saw the original letter, NHBT, just go back to it for a moment, 40s, NHBT 40191_011, which we looked at a moment or two ago. The second generation RIBA HCV assay, the RIBA is a confirmatory test that comes with it, or what? How do I understand that?
Yes, Sir Brian. The RIBA, the recombinant immunoblot,
Yes.
is the assay that gives you the anatomy of the stark antibody response that the ELISA will give you. So this was the second generation confirmatory assay from Ortho.
Thank you.
In relation to the second generation ELISA tests
Yes.
in April 1991, is it fair that you and others, from a scientific perspective, fully expected those second generation tests to show significantly improved sensitivity and specificity?
Yes, because the range of antigens on the solid phase was better, we would have expected not only increased sensitivity, but increased detection range. So the ability to detect more types of antibody positive samples. The specificity we wouldn't have known about. It was still on the same basic format, so the potential problems that the first generation assay had could still apply to the second. But if we had confirmatory tests, the supplementary tests really of Reba, because Reba wasn't totally confirmatory it was supplementary. It was giving you a clearer picture of what the antibodies were. But with that in place, we would have been much more comfortable.
Was there any reason why the testing of the second generation tests couldn't have occurred in parallel with the introduction of testing for all donations?
In hindsight, I believe not. I have to add, provided we've got the Rebas. Yeah, sorry.
Can I turn now to NHBT 00888770, please? No, that's not the right document. That's the 5th page. I need the first page, please. Do we have any further pages? Dr. Barber, I can't show you the first page, but there's nothing I particularly want to address on it other than to introduce the document, which is a document published in Reviews in Medical Virology in 1991, the heading of which is Blood Transfusion Services should have begun screening for hepatitis C when an antibody assay first became available. And it's described as a debate, I think. 4 was Dr.
Yes,
Brown, Professor Thomas, and you wrote the against bit of the article. Yes. What I'm going to do is pick up the journal article from page 3, please, which is where your writing starts.
Okay.
We can see at the bottom left against the proposition and your name.
Yes.
And if we go to the top of the second column, we can read this. What I'll do, Professor Barber, if I may, is read some of it and then I'll ask you a question about it.
Okay.
One single crucial factor in any decision concerning the introduction of a new, and in this case very expensive, pre-transfusion screening test for blood donations must be examined. In the absence of screening, can significant transfusion-transmitted disease be associated with the agent in question? This is often the factor that is most obviously prone to geographical variation. Although the data relating to chronic liver disease, Although the data relating chronic liver disease, CLD, to transfusion history are very sparse, striking differences are apparent between different countries. Then you address a study from Japan, which showed what you described as very high figures, suggesting an etiological connection between transfusion and liver disease, whereas you indicate there that wasn't present in UK studies. Then if we go down to the next heading, please. The rates of post-transfusion hepatitis in Japan and the UK mirror the extent of the association between CLD and a history of transfusion. While PTH rates in Japan are high, they are very low in the UK. Then if we go over the page, under the heading HCV seroprevalence, you note that surprisingly the seroprevalence in, for example, Japan, 1.5%, is not markedly different from countries such as the UK, 0.3 to 0.7%, although the rates of post-transfusion hepatitis differ enormously. again, in this article, you were making the same link, weren't you, that chronic liver disease is caused by post-transfusion hepatitis. So, again, in this article, you were relying on the reports of post-transfusion hepatitis to get to those seroprevalence, to get to the rates of post-transfusion hepatitis.
Yes, the incidence of yes.
And then if we see under the assays for anti-hepatitis, anti-HCV, you say the first generation assays for anti-HCV employed solely the C103 antigen derived from a non-structural region of the virus. Antibody responses to this protein may be more likely to reflect chronic rather than short-term acute infection with the agent. These assays suffered from the following disadvantages: low predictive value in the absence of supplementary tests, which were not available until some time after the screening tests were marketed, short-lived antibody in a significant proportion of subjects. In some cases, this may reflect false positive rather than genuine transient reactivity.
Did you want me to talk to that briefly?
Can I if I just go through to point 4 so that we have it. 3 is the long delay until seroconversion following infection, and 4 is the low titer of the anti-C100-3 response. What did you want to add to that, Professor Barbara?
Sorry, if we go back to the first two, point 1 and 2, yes, the C100 antigen, this point about it being from a non-structural region, this relates to the fact that when a virus replicates in its host cell, there will be proteins, antigens made as part of the virus production process that are not then incorporated into the actual structure of the virus. And in terms of tests for detecting antibodies to a viral infection, you get better antibodies to the actual virus bits itself, the structure. You have, if you imagine the virus floating around in the bloodstream, it's going to elicit more of a vigorous antibody response than the little bits of non-incorporated, non-structural antigen that are left in the infected cell. So that was one point I wanted to make, that although the antigen was specific to Hep C, it wasn't the choicest antigen to have derived. Because of what I've just said, and the fact that you haven't got the vigor of antibody response, if you had an acute infection, you're going to be less likely for an antibody to C100 to be positive than if you had a chronic long-term infection where cells would have been continually producing the non-structural proteins. So I just wanted to make that point clear there.
Picking up on that issue of antibody responses may be more likely to reflect chronic infection, did that give you pause for thought that perhaps acute symptomatic post-transfusion hepatitis was not a good marker to use for future issues with chronic liver disease?
That's a good point. I'm not sure that I'd work through that logic.
Particularly in light of the disparity between the rates of post-transfusion hepatitis in Japan and the UK.
Yes, I suppose that could have been a factor that one would have to consider. I would really have to think about that.
If we carry on then in this article to the conclusions, page 5, please. We can see that you've summarised the reasons for not initiating anti-HCV screening as soon as tests first became available as follows. 1, no evidence for an association of transfusion and chronic liver disease. Was that your view in 1991, that there was no evidence for an association of transfusion and chronic liver disease?
Yeah, I think that it was. One didn't link chronic liver disease with transfusion in any significant degree.
Then 2, very low rate of post-transfusion hepatitis and transfusion-transmitted HCV infection. I think we've already talked about the rates of PTH a number of times. 3, defects of the first available assays, low predictive value in low prevalence populations, possibility of false negatives. 4, absence of supplementary tests initially, and 5, enormous workload and cost implications with the risk of diversion of resources from existing screening programmes and the resulting dilution of their efficiency. Do these remain your views as to why tests were not introduced when they first became available?
Yes, as to why tests were not introduced when they first became available. Yes.
Can I then turn to NHBT 0036250_025, please? This is an attendance note taken by solicitors in December 1999. We can see that you attended their offices from 12:25 until 4:30 in the afternoon. And what we've got here is a 6.5-page note. So it's a very condensed note of what I understand was a lengthy conversation. Is that right?
I guess so. It's a way back, so these would have been condensed notes, yes.
Can we put up the third, fourth, fifth paragraph, please? He said, I think that's you, Professor Barbara, he said that he felt they were an open target. This is in the context of the litigation. He said he felt they were an open target because he thought they could make an issue of the decision not to use anti-HBC and ALT. Again, about the decision not to use the first generation tests. He thought that the gap between the introduction of the second generation tests and screening, which had been introduced, was indefensible. He didn't know what he could say about that. Just pausing there, is that still your view?
This is the summary that a legal individual would have made of our quite protracted discussions, yeah? This was what was summarised.
It's an attendance note with the solicitors, and as I said at the beginning, we recognise it's a very condensed note of a lengthy conversation.
Okay.
Just for my interest, the interview took about 4 hours. But how long is the note? How many pages?
Only 6.5 pages, sir.
I see.
I think it really is hard for me to remember at this stage, but I think this would be a fair summary of what I would have said. And both from a strictly legal point of view and also from a scientific point of view, my personal feeling at that time was that a gap between the introduction of second generation tests when they became available and then when actually screening was started would have been indefensible in the legalistic term, but also in the scientific term, that if we had a more specific test, then why weren't we using it?
And you go on to say they did, or the note records a summary of your conversation as follows. They didn't go for first generation tests because of the cost benefit, the lack of scientific evidence and the disruption to the blood supply. First, there were the first generation tests and there was a lack of confirmatory tests. And then the second generation tests, there wouldn't have been any reason other than a timetable as to why the second generation tests were not used, and he found that hard to justify. And then
Yes.
he would say that they never believed that hepatitis C was that serious, but he thought it would be difficult to hold to that view when the rarities were in front of him. Is that your recollection
yeah.
of what you explained at that time?
Yes, I mean, I think that's a fair recollection of what I was there at that time. Yeah. And of course, when you concentrate, if you suddenly bought a Skoda car, you begin to notice that everyone else seems to be driving Skodas. And so if you home in on a specific issue like serious cases of hepatitis C, it then becomes a more significant question. I can understand that.
So I'm about to move on to a different topic. I have 3 short matters I need to address with Professor Barbara, and then obviously we'll need to invite any further questions from core participants.
Well, when you say short matters,
I think I'll be more than 10 minutes, perhaps 15 or 20. But my timing, sir, unfortunately is as with many counsel, never very reliable.
Yes.
I may be shorter, I may be longer.
yes, well, I think in the light of that, what we'll do is we'll take a break now for lunch, come back at 2:05, if that's all right with you, Professor,
Indeed, sir.
and finish off those questions. Chances are we'll have another break sometime after 2:30 or thereabouts, and that will probably be the last break as such in the day, I would expect.
I hope I'm not adding to any delays.
Not
by
in,
somewhat confused responses.
No. For good heavens me, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that at all. The important thing is to get your evidence as clearly as we can and as well as we can, and we have the day set aside to hear you. So you need not worry. We're making very good progress, I think. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
2:05.
Thank you.